So what is desire? Right? When we use that word in everyday language, we mean that we want something, but humans want a lot of different kinds of things, right? We can want things that are necessary for our immediate survival, like eating or drinking or sleeping. But we also want things that are not necessary for our immediate survival. Like you might want success in your career, or you might want a good grade, or you might want to have a great time with friends, right? Now, these are not immediately necessary for you to be able to go on living, but they might contribute to your long-term goals or to your general well-being, or just to a sense of pleasure in your life. And so the parts of the brain, the mechanisms that create the desire for those different kinds of things, for survival versus non-survival things, are a little bit different. They have to be in order to motivate us to act in different ways. So when we talk about desire and the brain, we have to make a distinction between regulatory and non-regulatory behaviors. Like what kind of behaviors does our desire drive us to do? So regulatory behaviors would be anything that is necessary for our immediate survival, right? These would be the actions that we would take to maintain our basic homeostasis, right? So anything that we do to stay alive, right? These are generally going to be coordinated via the hypothalamus. And this makes sense because the hypothalamus is so integral to the maintenance of homeostasis through hormones. It's also incredibly important for the maintenance of behaviors that also maintain homeostasis. So any behavior that is going to help you to survive, to maintain homeostasis. So this would be things like eating and drinking and behaviors that you do to maintain a stable body temperature, right? Um, Things that you do to maintain your blood sugar or your blood salt levels, right? So this would be a horse licking a salt lick. And it's doing that because it's motivated to maintain stable levels of salt in its body. Or similarly, waste elimination. So all of these are things that we do to help maintain homeostasis. And the desire to complete these behaviors are called regulatory desires or regulatory motivation. And in contrast, we have non-regulatory behaviors, right? So these would be behaviors that are not necessary for our immediate survival, but could indirectly boost your long-term well-being. They help you to achieve a goal that might indirectly help you out later on, like having desire for a good job might give you resources that then increase your chance of surviving in the long run. And they can also boost the survival of the species uh, by increasing that individual's reproductive fitness, the likelihood that they're going to reproduce, and that the likelihood that their offspring are going to survive. So this would be the kinds of behaviors that would contribute to our indirectly contribute to our long-term survival or to our reproductive fitness. And these are actions that are going to be paired with an internal reward system. So rather than being satiated because you have returned to homeostasis, each of these behaviors is going to be associated with some sort of internal mechanism that rewards the animal for completing that behavior. So there's going to be some sort of incentive system that the brain creates rather than relying on the satiation of a drive associated with homeostasis. And so these behaviors and the desire associated with these behaviors are generally going to be coordinated by different brain parts, by the frontal lobes, by the mesolimbic pathway, and in particular the dopaminergic aspects of the brain. And the hypothalamus will be involved indirectly in some of these behaviors, but they're going to implicate a great many more parts of the brain. So the non-regulatory behaviors would include sexual behavior, right? Being interested in sex, parental behavior, aggression, having a food preference, so not just being hungry, but wanting a specific food because of its pleasurable qualities. Uh, and your interest, your curiosity, even just having some sort of sensory input available to you is part of this same system, right? Think about the last time that you left your phone at home and you realized that you had left your phone at home and that you're going to have to go the whole day without your phone, without the input, the sensory input from your phone, right? It probably made you feel a little bit anxious. I certainly feel that way when I do that. And that's because our phones and the input that they provide can activate these systems of reward. So simply just being curious about the world. So all of these things indirectly can influence our survival and our fitness. Now, we often hear of the phrase a sex drive, like people are driven to engage in sex. And really, we don't, as scientists don't think about um, sexual desire as a drive in the same way as they think about the desire for things that are linked to our immediate survival, like warmth or food or sleep. Right? No one ever died from lack of sex. So when we look at how sexual desire is um, is created by the brain, it actually looks much more like these non-regulatory behavior systems. It looks much more like the interest that we have in food preferences or the interest that we have in curiosity than it does the desire for salt consumption or the desire to eliminate waste. Okay. Now I've kind of referenced this idea of motivation a couple of times. So what's the difference between motivation and emotion? So these two concepts are really tightly linked, but there are some key differences. So broadly speaking, emotion is the psychological state that leads us to act, either in one of the regulatory or the non-regulatory behaviors that I just described. And motivation is the system that drives an action based on that emotion. Right? So an emotion is a brief, coordinated response, a set of synchronized responses across the subjective experience, your physiologic response, and your uh, actions and your expression of that emotion. Right? So that could be your facial expression or your verbal expression of how you're feeling or how you're acting. And these episodes of emotion serve as a coordinated heuristic that allow us to process really complex information that is pertinent to our survival, right? Information that includes our social, our environmental or internal cues, cues that come from inside our body. And these coordinated responses, these synchronized responses, help to evaluate this information, this complex information that's pertinent to our survival, to highlight the aspects of that stimuli that are significant, and to create some sort of adaptive response. Right? So it's a way of very quickly summarizing a wide variety of different stimuli, different inputs from our social interactions, from our environment, from our internal selves, and to summarize all of that together into a coordinated series of responses that help us to react in some way that's adaptive for our survival. But you'll notice the word motivated is included within emotion, right? So an emotion stimulates a motivated response. So what is a motivated response? Well, a motivation is an incentive system, right? It's the incentive to act. So it's generally going to be tied to one of these regulatory or non-regulatory systems of behavior. That it helps to coordinate an action based on an emotional experience, right? And this includes both the urge to act as well as the reward that you feel when you are acting or immediately after the action. Right? So you can think of the motivation as the aspect of emotion, right? So you notice the word emotion appears in this. Motivation is the aspect of emotion that compels you to action and rewards you for acting in a particular way. Now I realize that it's a little bit tricky to kind of understand the difference between these, especially considering that they both, each word appears in the other one's definition. But generally speaking, emotion is what we feel on our insides, and motivation is the urge to act. Okay? So motivation is going to translate your emotions into two kinds of adaptive behaviors, right? These are going to include the two different kinds of responses that you can have to an emotion. So you can either get activated and approach a situation, or you can be withdrawn and avoid that situation. Right? You can either be motivated to move forward or to pull back, right? To approach or avoid, to activate or withdraw. And if you think about it, you can probably guess sort of which kinds of emotions would go with which kinds of behaviors. Right? So take a second to think about the kind of key emotions, right? So these would include happiness, anger, sadness, fear, surprise, disgust, right? Think about those emotions for a moment and think about kind of what they would motivate you to do. Right? So think about happiness, for example. Would happiness encourage you to approach, to get activated, to move towards some sort of stimuli? Or would it make you withdraw, avoid, shut down, move away from that stimuli? Right? What do you think? Well, happiness would be considered an approach motivated behavior. So approach or activated behaviors would include joy, happiness, anger, as well as surprise or interest or curiosity, right? Curiosity killed the cat. Well, curiosity will make us approach something. And in contrast, sadness, disgust, and fear will make us pull back. It'll make us avoid that stimulus. It'll make us withdraw from a situation. And what's interesting is that at the level of behavior and at the level of the brain, that these two different kinds of sets of emotions and sets of behaviors will inhibit each other. So if you are feeling an approach emotion, like joy, it's going to actually make it harder for you to feel one of the avoid or withdraw emotions, to feel afraid, for example. And vice versa. If you're feeling sadness, it's going to be much more difficult for you to then be interested or excited or surprised by something, right? And you guys can probably think of tons of examples of this inhibition in your everyday life, right? Like if you go to a theme park and you're the kind of person who loves getting excited on roller coasters, right? Your joy, your happiness is going to inhibit your feeling of fear when you're on that roller coaster, right? Even though that's a really scary stimulus for some people, you're just feeling so much excitement and joy that you don't feel that as fear. You might be very physiologically aroused, but you're not feeling fear, right? And in contrast, if you're having a really sad day and you're feeling really grumpy and really withdrawn, it can be kind of hard to get interested in your classwork, right? And to be interested and excited about your studies. So, thinking about this, which of the following do you think would inhibit a disgust reaction? If you were feeling a lot of sexual desire or anxiety or sadness, which of these would inhibit feeling disgust? Take a second to think about it. All right, now if we were in class, I would take a moment to close up the poll and we would see what you guys had answered. But the correct answer here would be sexual desire or interest, right? If you are in a state of sexual interest or arousal, it's actually really quite difficult to get people to elicit a disgust reaction. And the same is true in reverse, right? If you're feeling pretty disgusted, it's going to be really hard for you to become interested in a sexual way. Okay. So I had mentioned when I went over the definition of emotion that there are multiple different components that contribute to the experience of emotion. So there are three major components to an emotion, and each are going to be controlled by a different aspect of the nervous system. So they all kind of coordinate each other, they all kind of influence each other. So you have the autonomic arousal component. And so this is going to be your experience of energy associated with an emotion, right? So this would be your heart rate starting to increase when you start feeling a really powerful, intense emotion. There's the subjective feeling. That's the psychological component, right? This is going to be the part of the emotion that you feel in your mind. And then there is the cognitive and behavioral responses to an emotion, right? These would be the thoughts that you have about that emotion and the behaviors that you engage in during that emotion. So that could include a facial expression that you make in response to that emotion, right? So let's think about what's happening to Violet here, right? She saw her crush, and immediately her heart starts pounding, right? And she starts feeling the kind of butterflies in her stomach associated with sympathetic nervous system activity, the autonomic arousal associated with seeing her crush. And in her mind, she's feeling, excited and interested and joyful and maybe a little bit afraid at the same time, right? Like depending on how excited she is, maybe that will inhibit her sense of fear or um, and then she's going to have some cognitive responses. Oh my God, he looked at me. What do I do? And some behavioral responses, right? Like slinking down and kind of getting a blush and a smile on her face. Okay. So these three different components to emotion are all going to coordinate together. They're all going to influence each other, right? If you notice that your heart is really, really pounding, that's going to make you have some thoughts like, oh my God, my heart is really pounding. I must be really excited. And that's going to change your perception, your subjective feeling of that emotion. And if you start thinking like, oh my God, he saw me, this is the most exciting thing ever, and I really like this person, that's also going to increase your autonomic arousal and change your subjective feeling, right? So these all are kind of coordinating together. So your autonomic arousal, not surprisingly, is going to be primarily coordinated by your autonomic nervous system. And as we talked about very recently when we talked about stress, your autonomic nervous system is going to be strongly tied to activity of the hypothalamus. So your hypothalamus is going to trigger your autonomic nervous system and its associated structures. So this would be, the sympathetic nervous system and the adrenal medulla and all of the aspects of autonomic arousal. Your subjective components the perception of emotion in your mind is going to be primarily coordinated by your amygdala and by the frontal lobes. And these two are going to work together to create the kind of shades of emotion. So the amygdala is going to provide information about the intensity of your emotion. How much emotion are you feeling right then? And the frontal lobes are going to color that in what particular aspect of emotion you're feeling, right? They're going to take that intensity and they're going to say, you're feeling a really intense sadness or you're feeling a really intense happiness, right? It's going to take what's called the valence or the direction of the emotion, the kind of specific quality of the emotion, and color over the intensity. So the amygdala, really responsible for the intensity of the emotion, and your frontal lobes are going to color the quality of the emotion. And then finally, your cerebral cortex is going to be responsible for the cognitive and the behavioral responses. So this is going to include your prefrontal cortex, your verbal cortex, your parietal cortex, all of the components that are associated with thinking and moving and acting. All right, moving on. So there's this debate in the field of emotion, in the study of emotion, which comes first? The psychological perception of an emotion or the physiologic emotional response, right? What comes first, the subjective component or the autonomic component? And there's different theories that say different directions. So the James Lange view of emotion is that physiologic changes produced by the autonomic nervous system comes first, and that the brain then interprets these changes as an emotion and produces the appropriate neural patterns to color that experience as an emotion. Right? So the James Lange view of emotion says that the autonomic nervous system responds first. It perceives some stimuli that could potentially be an emotional stimuli. It stimulates this physiologic response in the autonomic nervous system, and that information is perceived by the rest of the brain, which then colors them as an emotion. Right? It produces the appropriate neural patterns associated with an emotion. And there's some very good evidence for this theory. So one piece of evidence is that in individuals who have spinal cord damage, that they will have changes in the intensity and the quality of their emotions. Right? So as noted in your textbook, depending on where the spinal cord injury occurs, and therefore what aspects of autonomic and physiologic response might be impaired, you're going to see differences in the neural responses associated with emotion, right? So that would indicate that the physiologic damage is contributing then to problems with emotion in these individuals with spinal cord injury. Fascinating piece of evidence for the James Lange theory of emotion is the idea of excitation transfer. So excitation transfer is when we experience autonomic physiologic arousal in one situation, but if there is an emotional cue present, we will interpret that autonomic arousal as being related to an emotional experience. So according to the idea of excitation transfer, if you ran up a flight of stairs, right, your autonomic nervous system would be active because it's helping you to run up that flight of stairs. And when you got to the top of that flight of stairs, your heart would be pounding and your blood would be pumping. You just run up the stairs. If you then saw a spider and you were really scared of spiders, you would experience a fear response that would be really intense, really strong fear for this spider, because your brain would be interpreting your very high level of autonomic nervous system activity that you experienced because you ran up that flight of stairs, it would interpret that as part of the emotional response to that fear cue. So you would experience powerful fear because your brain is kind of coloring that experience with the underlying autonomic nervous system activity. So there's a researcher who's very prominent in this area, uh, Dr. Aaron, who has conducted a series of experiments looking at excitation transfer. And probably the most famous of these is the swinging bridge experiment. So let's take a look.
A high suspension bridge on a windy day is just the place to put Art Aaron's theory to the test, that danger can provoke passion.
We had an attractive young woman stand on this scary bridge, and every time a young man would walk across by himself, she would stop him and say, "Excuse me."
I'm doing an experiment for my psychology class on the effects of exposure to scenic attractions on creative expression. Would you mind filling out this questionnaire for me, please? There's a pen.
Almost all the men agreed to do it. After all, it was an attractive woman asking a man to do something. They didn't want to admit they were scared.
And then I have a picture for you to look at. And I'd like for you to write a brief dramatic story based on this photograph.
Okay. So the man would write the story, and when he was done, she'd say,
"Thank you. I appreciate your time. And I don't have a whole lot of time now, but I'd love to explain the experiment in more detail when I do have more time. So I'm going to give you my number, and then you can feel free to call me. It's at my hotel."
Okay. So she would write her name and phone number on the edge of her little sheet, tear it off, and hand it to her.
Great. Well, my name's Linda, so
okay.
I hope you call me.
Okay, Linda.
Thanks.
She stopped 20 men on the scary bridge, and then she stopped another 20 men on another bridge that was a big, heavy, safe bridge, not very scary at all.
I am doing a project for my psychology class on the effects of exposure to scenic
Of the men who met her on the scary bridge,
Please fill out this
many more phoned her that night than the ones who met her on the safe bridge. The other thing we did is we looked at the stories they wrote. Far more romantic and sexual content when they met a woman on the scary bridge.
She's embarrassed because her boyfriend wants to marry her.
Than when they met the very same woman on the safe bridge.
I think this woman is a little embarrassed about something that's really not that important at all.
Aaron believes that when our heart is pounding in our chest, we unconsciously look for the most attractive explanation. And if an attractive person of the right sex is standing by, then we're happy to assume we've fallen in love.
Now, on the other side of things, there's a set of theories that says exactly the opposite of the James Lange theory, that instead the brain detects some sort of stimulus that is going to have potential emotional significance, and that the brain then triggers a coordinated response which is going to include an autonomic physiologic emotional response. And two of the researchers who are most prominently associated with those sorts of theories are Cannon and Bard. So these are often called the Cannon-Bard theories. So the Cannon and Bard found a group of patients who had had neurologic damage to their autonomic nervous system. And these people had very discoordinated autonomic function. They either wouldn't experience any autonomic response at all, or they would experience it in really variable patterns. And they found that these individuals still had psychological emotional responses. They still said that they felt fear in situations where it would be appropriate to feel fear, and they felt love when it would be appropriate to feel love. Cannon and Bard also noted that if you provoke the autonomic nervous system in the absence of any emotional stimulus, that it doesn't create an emotion out of nothing, right? You do see excitation transfer, which is when autonomic nervous system activity gets interpreted as an emotional experience, but there needs to be some sort of emotional cue present. And so this is kind of an argument against the James Lange theory because even if you have autonomic nervous system activity, if there's no interpretation by the brain that it's an emotional experience, then you don't have a psychological emotional response. And probably the most compelling piece of evidence of the Cannon-Bard theory is that if you start acting as if you are feeling a particular emotion, eventually that will cause a change in the physiologic state associated with that emotion. So even if, in your mind you see a stimulus that would usually cause fear, a fear stimulus, but if you act as if you are not, right, you pretend that you're totally fine, then pretty soon your body will slowly start to lower its sympathetic nervous system activity. Right? If you act as if you are happy, even when you're not feeling particularly happy to begin with, eventually your autonomic nervous system will start to produce the patterns of response associated with happiness. Right? This is actually one of the tools that psychotherapists use to help patients who really struggle with different emotions. It's just act as if you were feeling the way you want to be feeling, and eventually the body will respond appropriately. So this certainly does seem to suggest that the brain is coordinating the autonomic response associated with uh, emotion. Probably in reality, neither one of these is 100% true. Right? Probably your autonomic nervous system is sending information that the brain perceives and then interprets as emotional information. And the brain probably is going to send messages to the autonomic nervous system to create physiologic responses associated with an appropriate emotion for that situation. Right? Probably these two things are happening at the same time. All right. So some of the emotional responses that we have are going to be things that we learned. And some of them are going to be innate, meaning that we were pretty much born having that response. So an innate releasing mechanism is a fancy pants way of saying it is a built-in emotional response without any prior experience. The moment you were born, you already would have this emotional response to that particular stimulus. And innate releasing mechanisms are going to generally be some sort of very adaptive response to some sort of um, stimulus that is relevant to our immediate survival. Right? So, in contrast, you can have preparedness. So, preparedness is a predisposition to pair a certain stimulus with an emotional and behavioral response, or a motivated response. So, a true innate releasing mechanism would require absolutely no experience to trigger it, right? You never have to have seen the stimulus before and you have an emotional reaction to it. And those are going to be pretty rare, right? They're going to be things that are generally only related to our immediate survival. But we have relatively more preparedness kinds of emotional responses. We have relatively more predispositions. These are going to be wired so that as soon as we have some experience, right, even just a minimal amount of experience, we will learn very quickly to pair that with an emotional response. So, an important example of preparedness is learned taste aversion. And probably you've experienced this at some point in your life when you tasted a new food and you got sick after eating that new food. And then the next time that you encountered that food, even if you just smell it, it would cause a really intense disgust reaction, right? You'd feel really grossed out just even smelling it. Or it might even cause a fear response, right? And so this is an example of one trial learning, emotional learning, right? You only had a very short single experience with that stimulus, but it's going to be paired with an emotional and behavioral response almost immediately. And we're actually adapted to make these kinds of pairings very quickly with food, because food and learning which foods are going to be okay for us to eat is extremely important for our survival. So we have a predisposition to pair foods that make us sick with a disgust response. So this is an example of preparedness. And there's some evidence that we are more likely to develop phobias, right, which is a pathologically strong fear response, to certain kinds of stimuli that in our evolutionary past were extremely important for our survival. So if you look at what people say they're really afraid of, there are some kinds of stimuli that it seems would make sense for us to be afraid of, right? That it shouldn't need to take that many exposures to that stimulus to learn a fear response. So things like snakes and heights and spiders, right? If you have encountered these even just once, your brain is going to be more likely to learn a fear response because of this preparedness principle, right? That we are going to have a predisposition to pair stimuli that are relevant for our survival with an emotional response. And it turns out that we are particularly prepared to pair emotional stimuli when we see others respond to that same stimulus with fear or aversion.
The same is true for other species. Monkeys brought up in captivity like this one have no reason to fear snakes. Their counterparts in the wild, however, will have learned to fear snakes from watching the reactions of other members in their group. In this experiment, the lab-reared monkeys watched video footage of wild monkeys reacting fearfully toward toy snakes. And after just 24 minutes, the lab monkeys had learned to fear toy snakes as well. This proves that fear of objects that are inherently threatening can be easily learned.
Now, in that video, you saw that the monkey's fear of the spider was not an innate releasing mechanism, right? Because the monkeys who had grown up in captivity and had never encountered a snake before had no particular emotional response to that stimulus. However, they did have preparedness to learn a fear response when they saw another monkey responding to that stimulus with fear. And it didn't take very much exposure to that stimulus, to that fear response in another monkey, in order for the monkeys who had grown up in captivity to learn that pairing. Okay, so innate releasing mechanism would be something that we have a built-in emotional response for, and we don't need any particular experience with that stimulus. We just know automatically. And preparedness describes the relatively more frequent phenomenon of having a predisposition to pair certain kinds of environmentally evolutionarily important stimuli with an emotional and behavioral response. So let's talk a little bit more about how the brain coordinates emotion. So the hypothalamus is going to be involved in all three components of emotion. So the hypothalamus is going to be doing kind of four main things to coordinate emotions and the motivated behavior that is associated with emotions. So firstly, the hypothalamus is going to stimulate the activity of the autonomic nervous system. Right? You remember when we talked about how the hypothalamus stimulates the stress response, right? It's a very similar kind of process. It is going to directly stimulate the activity of the sympathetic nervous system to produce the immediate physiologic component of emotion, right? So that would include things like increasing your heart rate. The hypothalamus is also going to stimulate the secretion of hormones via the activity on the pituitary. And the pituitary, right, is going to be stimulated by the hypothalamus. The pituitary is going to secrete hormones that are going to complement the autonomic contributions to the physiologic component of emotion. And those are going to activate brain circuits relevant to certain aspects of that emotion. So, for example, testosterone might be released in response to an aggressive act, an aggressive stimulus, and that is going to contribute to the individual's psychological perception of anger. The hypothalamus is also going to be sending information to other brainstem circuits and other aspects of the brain, to the motor and reward systems. And these are going to produce coordinated, motivated behaviors, right? So for example, in rodents, this would be digging in response to fear. Or in humans, this would be displaying an emotional expression, like smiling or showing fear on your face. And depending on which nucleus of the hypothalamus is stimulated, you can actually directly stimulate different kinds of emotion-mediated behavior. So you can actually directly stimulate the production of a genuine smile if you hit just the right part of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is sending information to other brainstem circuits, right, to help coordinate these behavioral responses, as well as to coordinate reward, right? So this is going to be stimulating the mesolimbic pathways, right, which are going to stimulate the dopamine-rich reward systems, right? These would include things like the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens and the anterior cingulate cortex, right? All of the parts that we learned about when we were learning about dopamine and the systems responsible for reward. So the hypothalamus is going to be sending information to the medial forebrain bundle and to the mesolimbic pathways, which are going to stimulate these dopamine-rich reward systems. And then lastly, the hypothalamus is going to be receiving information from the limbic system and from the frontal lobes, which are themselves responsible for kind of the subjective and the cognitive components of emotion, as we talked about previously. And it's going to create this cohesive whole perception. So the hypothalamus is going to take information about our autonomic nervous system activity, our hormone response to an emotion, our brainstem patterns of activity and the reward system patterns of activity, and activity of the limbic system and the frontal lobes. It's going to take all of this information together, and it's going to create a cohesive whole percept of that emotion, a whole perception of how you're feeling. So the limbic system is responsible for the central aspects of emotion. So by central here, I mean the central nervous system, not the peripheral nervous system. So not the physiologic, not the autonomic nervous system parts. This would be the subjective, the cognitive, the behavioral components. So emotion-related sensory stimuli are going to come into the sensory cortices. So let's say you see a spider, and that visual information is going to be sent to, well, first it will be sent to the occipital lobe, of course, where it will get processed, but then it'll get sent to the sensory cortex associated with visual information and the sensory association cortex. From the sensory cortex, it will be then sent to the anterior cingulate cortex, also known as the cingulate gyrus. And the anterior cingulate cortex, aka the cingulate gyrus, is going to bundle together the sensory information, right, the visual input from the spider, along with cognitive appraisals from the prefrontal cortex. So this would include interpretations of how big the spider is, or predictions, judgments about how likely is it to move this way, how fast is it moving, that kind of thing. So interpretations and cognitive and thoughts about that spider and its potential level of threat. So the anterior cingulate cortex is bundling together the sensory information with the cognitive appraisals from the prefrontal cortex. It's going to code this information as emotionally relevant. It's going to make the decision, okay, this is an emotional stimulus. And it's going to send that information to the amygdala and to the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is going to lay down this new information as an emotional memory, and it's going to compare that emotional experience to previous memories. Have I seen a spider before? Have I had scary experiences with spiders before? And it's going to send this information back to the anterior cingulate cortex via the mammillary nucleus, which is where it's going to rejoin this whole circuit. So that's what the hippocampus is doing with this information. The amygdala is going to create the subjective sense of emotion. It's going to code the intensity of the emotion, right? Feeling the fear of the spider. And it's going to determine the level of threat or the level of intensity of that emotion and send that information to the hypothalamus. And so it's going to tell the hypothalamus about what is the most appropriate response here, what kinds of behaviors should we engage, and how much of that behavior should we engage. Okay? And the hypothalamus is then going to engage in whatever is the most appropriate motivated behavior associated with that emotion. Ah, oh my God, it's a spider. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about the amygdala, because the amygdala is really, really key in the limbic system's emotional response, in how the brain produces an emotional response. So the amygdala, which is pictured here in this diagram, is a small, really, really tiny almond-shaped collection of nuclei that are located within the limbic system. And it's going to play a really key role in species-specific and emotional behaviors. The amygdala, you notice, is right kind of smack center in the middle of the brain. And that's very adaptive because it's receiving input from all of the different sensory systems. It's multimodal. Multimodal means that it responds to more than one sense modality. Right? So it's multimodal, it's listening to all of the different senses. And it's highly involved in particularly setting arousal response and the processing of fear-related stimuli. Although it is involved in all of the different emotional responses, it is primarily responsible for fear. So there's a little video here that will...
The amygdala has traditionally been considered part of the limbic system, a group of structures linked to the processing of emotions. The amygdala has historically best been known for its role in processing fearful emotions. When a threatening stimulus is present in the environment, it is thought that the amygdala is also involved in identifying it as a threat and initiating a fight or flight response to it. More recent evidence, however, indicates that the amygdala is active during the processing of positive stimuli as well. Thus, it is now thought the amygdala's role is more complex than that of a threat detector. It may be involved with assigning positive or negative value to stimuli, and with the consolidation of memories that have a strong positive or negative emotional component. It is also still being explored in a variety of other behaviors, ranging from addiction to social interaction. Thus, its functions are diverse and still not fully understood.
Okay. One of the other things that the amygdala does is that it influences our conscious awareness of the consequences of events via connections with the prefrontal cortex. So it helps us to be able to predict the likely outcome of a motivated behavior. And so in that little video we just saw, they said it's more than just a threat detector, right? It's telling us not just what is the likely threat associated with that fearful stimulus, but also what are the likely outcomes of acting in a positive manner. And when the amygdala gets damaged, it can cause some pretty significant behavioral deficits as well. A very classic case of amygdala damage is the case of SM.
So SM is one of the most famous case studies in all of affective neuroscience. She's a woman who is currently, I think, in her 40s. And as far as we can tell, the destruction of her amygdala has left her essentially fearless to at least external stimuli. And to test whether SM is in fact fearless, the researchers who worked with her took her to a couple of the most frightening places that they could think of in the local area. So one was an exotic pet store, and they offered her exotic snakes to hold in the store, even though she says she's afraid of snakes. Many people would hesitate to hold a snake right up to their face and touch its tongue and inspect its face really closely, but SM had no problem doing that. They also took her to a place that's, it is at least called the most haunted house in the United States. And they decorated up for Halloween, and they have people, the staff, dressing up as monsters and things to try to scare people. And the researchers in SM went through with just a regular group. And all the other people who were in the group, as soon as they were in this haunted house, it was apparently very spooky, were, huddling together, and they were really slow to go around corners. And SM was taking the lead and saying, "Come on, guys, follow me." And she would be the first around the corners. And when the monsters jumped out and tried to scare her, apparently she would scare them sometimes because she had no fear response to them, which they were not expecting. And so what was really interesting about this is that SM is not emotionless. She experienced a lot of curiosity and excitement, which we think are governed by other regions of the brain predominantly. But she just doesn't seem to have any normal anticipatory fear response. But her lack of a fear response gets her in trouble. So she apparently walks home in the evenings through sort of a vacant lot, and she was mugged there at one point, and I think at knife point. And most people, when something scary like that happens to you and you are at risk of getting hurt, you have a normal fear response when you're approaching that same place that would send you avoiding it. I mean, that's what the fear response is all about, avoid things that might hurt you. And she doesn't have that response, so she continues to take that same route home every night by herself.
Now, SM is a very special case because she had very, very focal damage to just a little tiny piece of her amygdala. And so she ended up having relatively okay function in other parts of her brain. So sort of the classic response to amygdala damage we see in SM, which is decreased fear response. But you will also see in patients who have had amygdala damage indiscriminate sexual behavior, meaning that they will engage in sexual behavior under any circumstance. These would be folks who would masturbate in public, for instance, or who would expose themselves in public. You'll also see, for whatever reason, a tendency to examine objects by mouth. So instead of relying primarily on the visual system, folks who have amygdala damage more likely to pick something up and stick it in their mouth. And if you think about what other kinds of people are like this, Babies will do that a lot. Before their visual system really fully develops, they're going to use their mouth to explore around them. And so there's an argument that this tendency to explore things by mouth in amygdala patients is essentially sort of a regression back to that earlier point in development. All right, so we've talked a fair amount now about how the brain helps to generate emotions, but it's just as important to know how the brain contributes to controlling your emotions, right? You don't want to act on every single feeling you ever have, because sometimes that will get in the way of achieving your long-term goals. So self-regulation refers to anything that we do to control our emotions, to either increase or decrease our emotional state, and or expressing or acting on your emotions. And broadly speaking, there are two components of emotion regulation. So there's explicit regulation and implicit regulation. Explicit regulation, let's start with implicit regulation. Implicit regulation refers to those strategies that we use to regulate our emotions that happen unconsciously. So these are things that we're not even aware that our brain is doing, but will change our emotional state. So things like paying more or less attention to an emotional stimulus, and that will change how we're feeling. Explicit regulation, on the other hand, is going to be anything that we do consciously to regulate our own emotions. So these are going to be the things that we tell ourselves to do, things like counting to 10, delaying action, taking deep breaths, trying to relax our bodies or our muscles, trying to cognitively reframe the experience, try to think about what's happening in a new way to help you feel differently about it. Thinking about your long-term goals and reminding yourself of why you can't act right just then. And each of these different regulation strategies is going to rely on a different part of the brain to help regulate. So implicit regulation is largely going to be coordinated by activity of the anterior cingulate cortex, the ventral anterior cingulate cortex, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Whereas explicit regulation is going to be more related to activity of the pre-supplementary motor area, the supplementary motor area, the parietal cortex, and the dorsolateral and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. What's interesting to me as a psychologist is that there's research that shows that if you use these explicit regulation strategies often enough, particularly if you use them when you're feeling really strongly, powerfully emotional, that over time, these explicit regulation strategies actually become more implicit, meaning that the parts of the brain that coordinate your reaction to emotions and your regulation of emotions actually is going to move more in the direction of the parts of the brain that are associated with implicit regulation. And this is largely one of the ways in which psychotherapy works, is by shifting explicit regulation strategies to become more implicit. However, you'll notice that both explicit and implicit regulation strategies will rely on activity of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the primary driver of emotion regulation. So the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobes are going to coordinate your executive function. This refers to long-term planning, decision-making, judgment, ability to plan and coordinate your actions according to that plan, and being able to sequence information to be able to coordinate together large swaths of information and kind of pull out the pieces that are most important to your immediate actions. And thinking about the fact that the prefrontal cortex is the primary driver of emotion regulation, you might be able to see the answer to this question here. Why are children so often poor at emotion self-regulation? Why is it hard for kids to hide what they're feeling or to not act on what they're feeling? So take a moment to answer this in your notes. And the answer here, of course, is that the prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to fully develop, as we talked about in our lecture on development. The prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to undergo its completion of its synaptic pruning. It's the last part to myelinate,
And so because this part of the brain is still developing, it's much more difficult for kids to regulate their emotions, particularly to use those implicit self-regulation strategies. So it's not necessarily true that their amygdala is more active, although, as we'll see, the prefrontal cortex does contribute to the overall amygdala activity, but rather more so that their prefrontal cortex is not regulating their emotions. So the prefrontal cortex is critical for emotion regulation and for coordinating complex behavior, and it's able to do so because it has extensive inputs and outputs, right? Almost all of the perceptive areas and motor areas and many of the subcortical structures will all feed into the prefrontal cortex, so it can receive information from across the entire brain. And likewise, the prefrontal cortex is able to speak to every other part of the brain, more or less. It has many outputs to be able to coordinate its decisions. Once it's made its decisions, once it's made its plan, it's able to send that plan to many different areas of the brain to help carry that out. And importantly, there is an aspect of the prefrontal cortex which has direct connections with the hypothalamus and the amygdala. So the orbitofrontal cortex, which is part of the prefrontal cortex, has direct connections with the amygdala and the hypothalamus. And through activity of the orbitofrontal area, we're able to decrease activity of the amygdala. So this can dampen your initial emotional responsiveness, decrease the amount of amygdala activity that you'll have over time. And because the prefrontal cortex is so important for emotion regulation, any kind of damage or suppression of activity of the prefrontal cortex can have some pretty significant effects on social and emotional behavior. So unfortunately, in our medical history, we used to use lesions of the prefrontal cortex to manage patients who had extremely aggressive or otherwise problematic behavior, emotional behavior. And so these prefrontal lesions would destroy aspects of the prefrontal cortex. And essentially what this did was it created extraordinary apathy and loss of initiative or drive. So initially the patient would look better because they're not as aggressive, but they also lacked the ability to have any kind of long-term goals or any kind of long-term planning. And so they essentially they lost all initiative. And they had inability to experience and express their own emotions and to recognize emotional expression in other people. They lost the ability to recognize other people's emotional states as emotions. So they had very poor decision-making, very poor ability to plan and organize, and so very quickly the medical community realized that these lobotomies, these prefrontal lobe lesions, were not an effective way to manage emotional behavior. So thank God we no longer do that anymore. However, a lesser, more temporary version of damage to the prefrontal cortex is alcohol intoxication. So alcohol has a very powerful effect, damping down the activity of the prefrontal cortex. And so it's going to reduce the inhibitory control of the prefrontal cortex on the amygdala. So here in this picture, we have the picture of brain activity. And so blue here is deactivation and yellow is activation. And so this is activity of the functional connectivity from the amygdala to the orbitofrontal cortex. So essentially, here on placebo, the orbitofrontal cortex is telling the amygdala, calm down, it's okay. Those pictures of angry faces, you don't need to react to that right now. They're just pictures. They're not actually threatening you. But when the same person is then given an alcohol administration, there's very strong deactivation of the orbitofrontal cortex. And so their subsequent activity of the amygdala is going to continue to increase and increase without any damp on it, which is Which is why when your sloppy drunk friend is sloppy drunk all over you, not only do they seem to have more intense emotions, but they're also changing in their emotions very rapidly, right? They can go from being belligerent to, oh my God, dude, you're like my best friend ever and I love you so much, right? And that's because the prefrontal cortex, and particularly the orbitofrontal cortex, is not smoothing out the transitions between emotional expressions. So here's another question for you guys. Prefrontal cortex damage is more common among prisoners than in the general population, and here's a couple of reasons why. So take a moment to read through them and to make a note, to make a guess. So the answer here would be all of the above. So people who are in prison are more likely to have experienced brain injuries, which will damage their prefrontal cortex. They will be more likely to have been exposed to toxic level of drugs and alcohol, which again will generally target the prefrontal cortex. People who end up in prison tend to have poorer impulse control. It's harder for them to be able to regulate their emotions and or to keep themselves from acting on their emotions. And finally, people who end up getting caught are poorer planners. So there's actually some people who argue that prisoners, that the number one reason why we tend to see more prefrontal cortex damage is that just prevents people from being able to plan better crimes. All right, so in this last little section of the lecture, we're going to talk about reward systems, right? The systems that help to coordinate activity of those non-regulatory motivation systems. These are going to be the things that the mechanisms that have evolved to increase our adaptive fitness, to engage in certain kinds of stimuli, with certain kinds of stimuli, or to engage in certain behaviors that might promote our long-term fitness, either survival or reproduction, but are not part of our regulatory system per se. So the mesolimbic dopamine system is incredibly important for reward. One of the first experiments that looked at this system was Olds and Milner back in 1954. And they were one of the first experimenters to look at direct electrical stimulation of different parts of the brain. So they put electrodes in rodents' brains and then put a lever in the rodent's box so that the rodent could choose whether or not they wanted to directly stimulate that part of the brain. And they found that when they put an electrode into certain parts of the brain, that it activated this reward system. So the rats would then push that lever over and over and over again, trying to get that reward sensation. So they found that the lateral hypothalamus and the medial forebrain bundle, both of which are part of the mesolimbic dopamine reward system, were particularly important parts of the brain for stimulating this reward for the self-stimulation through the lever pressing. And they similarly found that dopamine was an important neurotransmitter for getting this animal to engage with this stimulus over and over again. However, there are actually two different independent but related processes that go into reward and our sense of reward. So there's wanting and liking, and these are actually separate. They're coordinated by different parts of the brain and by different neurotransmitter systems. So wanting is your sense of incentive and motivation. This is your motivation to seek out that stimulus or to engage in that behavior again. Whereas liking is your evaluation of pleasure, right? These are going to be anytime that you feel good, right? This is going to be associated with activity of the liking pathways. And so these are both going to take advantage of different pathways. So the wanting pathway is going to involve dopamine, and it's going to connect your ventral tegmental area and your anterior cingulate cortex, as well as the ventral tegmental area to the orbitofrontal cortex within the prefrontal cortex. And these are going to be more immediately impacted by drugs of abuse that act on dopamine, right? So these are going to be examples like cocaine. Liking, on the other hand, is going to be coordinated by this red pathway here. So activity of the nucleus accumbens connecting them to the orbitofrontal cortex, to the prefrontal cortex. And liking is going to take advantage of the opioid signaling system as well. And so sometimes you'll see in the case of opioid addiction, somebody will say that they no longer enjoy the drug, but they desperately want it, right? Particularly in the case of, say, heroin addiction, right? And this is because that opioid system has essentially taxed itself out. You've burnt out the liking side of the reward pathway, but the wanting side is continuing to be ramped up. And so you may want that heroin really badly, but it no longer feels good. And so many heroin addicts will say they need the heroin just to feel like a normal person, but it no longer makes them feel good. They don't like the sensation anymore. And this reflects the fact that these are technically independent processes that are coordinated by different parts of the brain and by different neurotransmitter systems.